Hi, my name is Benedict for Higher Hertz. This video is about TAL-NoiseMaker. NoiseMaker is a free offering from the developer TAL, Telugu Audio Line. TAL's been around for a lot of years. He was one of the probably a second wave of developers. He has quite a well-known name. He tends to be one of the first names offered when people are saying, "Oh, I need a free something that's good." So his name will be put forward. He's most famous for his Juno 106 emulator. He now also has a Jupiter 8 emulator. I can understand why people like those as much as they do. As you'll see as we go through this, he has nailed a certain kind of Rolandy sound, which if you're after the Rolandy sound, great. Let's take a quick walk through some presets that I have made with this fairly quickly. So very Keith Emerson prog rock kind of brass, excels at that sort of stuff. Now, if you don't like the sounds that I've made, then that doesn't mean that you can't make sounds that you don't like. I'm merely showing you some of the range using some sort of classic pointers as to what we might achieve. See if you recognize this. Obviously based around the very famous duophonic leads from a certain French fellow. I'll be open and say I did have to cheat slightly. In this case, I used an external phaser and then a delay line because that's the way that you get that sound. So sweet synth strings are definitely very doable. Within the same patch. Okay, big sort of monster is coming type sound. So let's take a bit of a walk through the synth. Just arrange ourselves a little bit more neatly. There we go. Make sure this stays open. If you're wondering, I'm working in Reason. This synth is working nicely in Reason. It automates in Reason. The intro that you heard at the beginning there made this in Reason. I say that because some devices don't behave nicely in Reason. This one does so far, and that's a good thing. So the synth, when you come to it, there are presets. I'm not going to go into those. I'm sure there are plenty of people who have. It's free. You can download and try them. There seem to be a good set of sounds, but I've never been a preset guy. So we'll go back to the default preset. It does come with a sub-oscillator in. I recommend straight away get rid of the sub-oscillator. Now the sub-oscillator will run on its own and it's not tied to the tuning of anything else. So it merely is taking the MIDI note that you play and playing one octave below. Sounds like it's probably playing a square or a pulse wave. There are other synths that will handle that differently. That's what it's doing. I'm not a fan of sub-oscillators per se. So we'll walk quickly through our architecture. We've got a pair of oscillators, mixing them to go into the filter through the amplifier, and then we can modulate with a pair of LFOs, a second mini envelope here, and a complex graphic envelope, multi-stage beast of an envelope, into a couple of effects, a chorus which is built around the Juno model, so the pair of choruses, chorus 1, chorus 2, and it has a very distinctive sound. It's either wonderful or not, but most of the time it's kind of wonderful. If you've listened to any songs like Real Life Send Me an Angel or Journey stuff, any of those sorts of things with great big chorus, that is either exactly, literally a Juno chorus or something that's meant to sound like it. It goes into a reverb. TAL's reverb is pretty well known. You can actually get that as freeware and then into a delay. We'll work our way through them one by one. So we start with the oscillator. Each oscillator has different options for waveforms. This is a common enough thing. For me, it's a slight frustration, but this is a very common thing in cut-down synthesizers. One of the reasons that people think that they're going to be easier to use is because they've got a more limited feature set. One of the reasons I find them frustrating to use is because they've got a limited feature set. However, I'm not being negative. How a synthesizer developer manages that architecture defines whether you end up with a cool synth which you can get great results out of, or a synth which looks simple on the surface but is just always going to be a nightmare to use and limits your options so much that it becomes a best one-trick pony. This is far more of the former. You can do quite a lot in here if you apply yourself. So basically, a pair of oscillators, standard tuning, double-click things, go back where they belong. Phase. Phase is shifting where that waveform starts. So you've got a picture of what the waveform looks like. With phase set to 0, it's going to start here, finish here, and start again. Just keeps looping. If we move our phase to 50%, then it goes to halfway through, which really would be sort of here or somewhere or other, which means that it starts halfway through. So if this is at 50% and this is at 0, then your phases actually invert, which means that oscillator 2 will cancel out oscillator 1. And you can get this close to, if not literally to, do that complete Star Trek phase cancellation. There are reasons for that. It's a slightly unusual thing in a synthesizer to have, especially at this level, but it does mean that there are times where you can offset the phase of these two oscillators and get a bit of a different sound. So it's a nice thing that it's there. If you're confused by it, ignore it, which is always the best way to start. If you don't understand a thing, just don't play with the knob for now until you do understand it. Understanding will come easier that way than if you keep going, but this should, because all that does your head in and makes you feel bad. Difference between these two oscillators is here. Obviously the wave choice difference, but in this extra knob here. Pulse width. With the square wave, we can change the relationship between the up part of the wave and the down part of the wave. So the picture here shows up, down, We've got 50%, we're 50% up, 50% down. That's a square wave. If we move this way, we can be sort of 90% up, 10% down. And that gives us a very thin sounding wave. This doesn't quite go to nothing, 100 nothing, but close enough. So maybe sort of 99 to 1 or something like that. And then the other way round. Pulse widths are a big part of that Juno type sound. So having access to this is pretty important. And then a noise oscillator. Noise oscillators can be used for quite a lot. There's also another noise source down here. That's a synth wide. You just add noise into the output. There are good reasons to do that as well. So if we get a pair of oscillators and drive them into the filter. I use the word drive deliberately because my understanding of this is that the louder these are, the more signal you feed into your filter, the more the input section of that filter gets overdriven. And that will change the sound. You'll end up with a crunchier sound, which is either really good, basses and things like that can benefit from being driven. However, if you're trying to make string sounds and they sound like they were chewed by a bear, then you probably are just running far too much level into your filter. So pull them back here. So for the moment, I will work on just using nice safe levels at halfway. We can fine tune to give us that chorusing type sound. Changing our levels here, obviously. There are times where we would want to run something at less than full level. It's easy to initially think when you're starting out with synthesis that everything has to be 100% all the time, otherwise you're just not doing it right. No, not at all. It's in subtlety. So it adds a the ability to be fairly subtle, which is nicely enough handled. Sub adds that sub. As I said, I'm not a fan. You can transpose the whole synth. Nice enough to have that. You can detune the whole synth, which means you can run multiple versions of the synth playing the same notes. So you launch 4 tracks, copy the MIDI onto all 4 tracks. You apply the synth and then detune each one, and you end up with a massive unison. Ring mod, that's handled by ring modulating these 2 outputs. It's important to understand they're ring modulating from here far more than ring modulating from here. And you might go, but they're the same thing, but it depends where you source your ring modulator from as to what result you get. So it can cause everything from a kind of tremolo through to strange clangorous noises. Mostly when it's put in this kind of structure, it will be used just to add a little bit more grit, a little bit more bite. Play with it with care, understand that with certain kinds of sounds, it's just going to make them sound nasty. As will FM. That is multiplying the frequency of one oscillator by another. You will not really get DX7 type FM sounds out of this. Again, this will be used to add bite or grit or plain clangorous, as in belly kinds of sounds to things. Very easily will make things sound nasty, but in the right situation will give you a very dramatic sort of a sound. Going into filters, we get given a pretty reasonable handful of filters here. The low pass, that is going to be the ladder style Moog filter, so mini Moog type thing. Different roll-offs, 6, 12, 18 dB filters are a bit of an odd one. They're a myth. The myth being that some people think that they were used on the TB303. They weren't. It was a 24 dB filter with a diode. But for some reason, since that myth came out and people started putting them on software synthesizers, there's nothing wrong with them. They sit between, obviously, in byte, between a 12 and a 24. They have a character. I can't say it's a character I've ever used, but they exist. You've also got high pass, which rather than cutting off everything above the filter point, cut off everything below the filter point. And a band pass, which cuts everything on both sides of the filter. So that's effectively creating that sort of shape, as opposed to this sort of shape for a low pass, or this sort of shape for a high pass. Bandpass filters are easy to not get, but once you get them, they can be wonderful for creating sounds that sit perfectly inside a mix. Take your time with them. A notch, quite literally, is doing something more like this. It's just saying, okay, we'll take this particular band and just chop it out. Again, easy to bypass, but a notch can give you a really lovely feel in strings and pads and things like that. You might then want to apply another filter after the synth to roll off highs or something like that. There are then what appear to be state variable type filters. These have all been applied in a 24 dB, which seems a little unusual simply because the state variable in the SEM, the white box, was a 12 dB filter. But these have been applied as a 24, which is more aggressive than a real SEM, but they still have a nice sound. So the basic shapes there. 24 dB band pass is pretty aggressive, but within a mix will give you a very nice result. And then this one, They say it's a no feedback low pass filter. It's not explained. Unfortunately, the manual that I got from the website did not refer to this version. It was showing a different, older GUI. Now, this is a much nicer GUI. So this one, play with the filter, see what you like. If you don't want the filter, you can turn it off. For the moment, we'll stay with the 24 dB state variable. I quite like this. You can assign key follow. It seems rather subtle in this case, but what the key follow should do is make your filter cutoff move with the keyboard. So if you're using a cutoff here, actually let's try one of the other shapes. But you notice it gets duller and duller as we go up the keyboard. But with key follow it should get brighter. I don't feel like it's having the effect that I'm used to there. But that's the logic behind that. Calls it contour, commonly just referred to as filter envelope or modulation. And this is this envelope here. And this has very nice sounding oscillator filter relationships. For a free instrument, you get access to very nice sound overall. Again, if you're after that Roland type sound, this is really delivering that kind of in spades. So that is nice. So you've got quite a bit of versatility there in how you set up your sounds. Amplifier, this is another envelope section, so it lets you decide how you want the levels, which is kind of like volume but not quite the same, but how you want the sound to speak in terms of level over time. Obviously makes a very different instrument from or so this is how you set up how your sound behaves over time, whether you're wanting pianos or organs or whatever. Sustain, one warning I give there is, as a mix engineer, far too often people send me things where they've launched a sound and they leave it hang in the mix, often like this. And the trouble is it just sits there and it becomes a dead dog in the mix. So if your sound's going to sit, you've got to make sure it stays moving, which brings us to modulation, although actually we'll start modulation here. There is another envelope hiding here. Easy to miss it. I did. And this you can assign to something. Let's assign it to oscillator 2 for the moment. It's oddly assigned in the sense that its default has it all the way down in the default sound. So we can set that to modulate. And it adds a little bit more character to a sound. That's just another modulation source. very useful to add those little bits to a sound, because they really bring it alive in the mix. Other forms of modulation, we've got these pair of LFOs, the obvious one being for vibrato. Now everything reads out down here. Different shapes, reasonable amount of different shapes. It'll default to sine wave. If you find that seems a little aggressive, go with the triangle wave. If you want more aggressive, then go with the square wave. That's more for sound effects. As is this. You can trigger them so that they start in the right place every time, and again adjust your phase so that things start in exactly the right place. If you're obsessed with having every sound exactly the same every time you play it, be careful with that, because you can ruin the ability for the song to mix up nicely when everything is perfectly locked to everything else. That goes with tempo syncing LFOs and tempo syncing delays as well. Be very careful. Very easy to say, oh, but now it's perfect. Problem is it won't mix nicely because everything is so locked in place that the human brain will dismiss just about everything you've done. Movement is where it's at. But pretty cool LFOs. Go from really pretty darn slow up into audio rate. So you can actually FM your filter. Kind of cool. We can FM, and we'll FM both of our oscillators for the moment. Always kind of sounds awful, but it's a useful trick for adding a little bit of grind to a sound. Get rid of that there. It's a bit straight and lifeless. We don't necessarily know that modulation is there, but it's adding a kind of a grit and a grind that'll mix up nicely and sound great inside the mix. So you've got usual basic assignments, but you can move things. Now, pulse width, we can definitely do. Pulse width is just for oscillator 1. Has to be a square wave. When it's very fast, it's just kind of ugly. When it's slow, it does sound nice. So it adds a vibrato-like movement, but that movement is actually changing the wave shape, which means that the timbre is changing, not the pitch. So you can do things like assign one of the oscillators with a pulse width, which is that one. The other oscillator you could assign to have a vibrato. Now you've got a really broad sound. Makes a nice string sound. We'll put a little bit of movement there to oscillator 2. So as the note starts, oscillator 2 just drifts up. So there's a lot of movement on the beginning of that sound now. It's going to sit really nicely in a mix and feel very big, which is that a lot of that feel, as I said, real life Symbian Angel or Journey sounds. They have that really big fat feel, and this is how it's done. Just a few layers of moving things around. And speaking of moving things around, we've got this beastie here, which again is another envelope, only it's more complex. You can assign lots of things that you might want to do with it are not super attractive. Although in the right situation, that actually has its charms. That does too. Change your volume as well. Probably. That's nice. Pad inside a mix work out very nicely. So let's you have to get used to how some things work. Some things work in a unique fashion, and you just have to accept that that's how it's going to be. You learn that by playing with it. When things don't necessarily go the way you think they're going to go, just accept that they're going to go the way that they do go. There is a logic to them. Then move to effects. We've got our chorusing. As I said before, these are the pair of Juno choruses. One's faster, one's slower. Put the two together, you get an enormous kind of chorus. Just make sure that even though they sound great when you turn them on, that they're not making you lose the essence of the sound. Because anything with the chorus on will sound good on the surface, but then when you come to mixing it, too much chorus will just make mush. So go cautiously with them. There's a bit crusher, which I'm going to leave alone because I've never liked bit crushing. I get the charm, and occasionally I'll do it for things, but it's not a thing I like. That reverb. Pre-delay means that there's a little bit of gap between the sound and the reverb starting, which is a good way, especially with a reverb like this, to give a little bit of sense of allowing the sound to seem in front of its reverb. You can roll off sections of the sound. We can get rid of bass, which we commonly do want to do. And we can get rid of high end as well to make a warmer sound. So it allows us to run more of everything, I guess. Delay. Again, default setting not super keen on. I think it's too much feedback and it just starts to go straight into self-oscillation. And seeing the delay that comes after the reverb, I tend to be far more of a delay before reverb kind of guy. Then it can carry on forever. It sort of defers to really long times. 4 seconds is just an immense amount of time. So it makes it a little harder to use the short times. I use short times a lot more than long times. You can sync, but again, my advice is not to. You can set one or both of these to double the time that's stated, to get a kind of ping pong, but it's not a real ping pong. Now, this is backwards from what we've just done here. This makes sense. We have the high pass, as in we're getting rid of low frequencies, and low pass, we're getting rid of high frequencies. But then we've got a high cut here. That's actually your low pass. It is cutting the high frequencies, so technically correct, but it's just odd. I kept using it backwards and wondering why it started to sound kind of horrid. And that's going to make a very nice sound in the mix. It's going to be arresting, but it'll also sit nicely inside, and where it's held, it is lowering itself in volume, which is good, but that constant movement, which is a little wonky, is going to, thank you, allow it to stay in mind a lot longer than something that has no movement at all. Or maybe we need to unassign that. Because that just becomes dead too fast. So. Now level back up. Velocity, we can set velocity to various features. So we can set it to the overall level of the synth, to the therefore the harder or faster we play our keys, the more the filter gets opened up by the envelope. And also for the filter cutoff. If they're not working for you, don't knock yourself out. There'll come a time where you realize, oh, that's how I can use those performance features. So not having them on by default is actually in many ways a really nice thing, especially on a entry-level synthesizer. Pitch wheel can be set to our cutoff. It's despite the pitch wheel being mostly aimed at pitch. There's no mod wheel assignment here. It goes up in both cases. If you go down, it goes up. If you go up, it goes up. But it goes back to its default state in the center. So there's a certain logic, a certain charm to doing it that way, just a bit odd. Otherwise, your pitch wheel can be assigned to your pitch. Oh, which reminds me, we didn't look at portamento before. Portamento, when it's off, it does nothing. When it's on, allows you to do those slides from one note to another. You can also have it in auto mode, which only works when you're in mono. No slide. We need to expand that slide. So it allows the slide to happen only when your notes overlap, legato. It is a nice thing actually to have a little bit, even on pads or string sounds. It can sound really wrong, or it can add just a nice little bit of spice to the beginning of a sound. Entirely up to you which way you go with that. If it seems too much, just pull it down. But there'll be some things where it's just never right at all, in which case turn it off. Depends how you feel about pitch movement. Now, these calibrations, there's a high pass which pulls out the low end. And you might think, why would I ever want to do that? Because it's all about the bass, man. And it's like, because, yeah, if you've got too much bottom end in a mix, it'll never work. Ever. Doesn't matter what most mixes where you think it's all huge amounts of bottom end, it's actually not. Talk to any seasoned mix engineer and they'll help you understand that. But you can, if your sounds are too thick, pull out some of that, which is it's a nice enough feature. Me, I'll be doing it on my mixing desk, but it's not a bad thing to have. There's an inbuilt synth-wide wander. It's not triggered by the note, it's just across the whole synth. It's got like a wandering tune, but that applies to both oscillators together. They don't wander separately from each other, they just wander together, but still better than nothing. So applying a little bit of that will give your synth a much warmer, more real feel inside a mix. So don't poo-poo it at all. It's a nice feature to have. Is that secondary noise? This is not meant as a main noise source. You'd use that from an oscillator, but adding a little bit of noise will help a sound feel a little bit more present. Some sounds will really benefit from it, some will not. This one, I think, not so much, or just a tiny little bit of noise. A lot of bass sounds can benefit from quite a lot of noise because that helps pull them forward in the mix. There's also distortion. This is synth-wide, and you can hear it biting there. It will either flatter or ruin. One or the other, entirely up to you. In this particular sound, I don't like it so much. A little bit maybe. I wouldn't make those decisions personally until I was putting it in the mix as to what role that's going to have. It does frustrate me when I get sounds that come to me like that. And it's like, yeah, it's got so much bite, man. It's like, it sounds like it's been chewed and will never make it beautiful. So if you're unsure, go either very gently or just not at all. Your mix engineer will make the decisions as to how to make that fit nicely in the mix. If he doesn't know how to do that, don't hire him. It's not worth it. Or don't hire him for more than $5. That basically covers all the features of the synth. It's a nice instrument. If you're starting out, there are far worse places to start than this. Understand it will be a little tricky to get your head around, simply because every instrument's going to be a little tricky to get your head around. It has its limits. Those limits are from the nature of such a simple instrument, and they are also, to be very fair, designed to encourage you to look at his larger products, namely the Juno 106, his Jupiter 8. He's got a rather natty-looking little modular. So if you're like me, after lots of modulation, then his little modular looks rather cool. There is also a sample playing instrument, which I think is probably rather good. If I wasn't a Reason man with an NXT, then I think that probably would have caught my eye. But you can do a lot worse than starting with NoiseMaker. It's a current product, because there are other products that people go, oh, get that, but they're not being developed anymore. There's no backing for it. I would again like to see a new manual, which is actually current and up to date and reflects what we see on screen. But even there, when you're using the manual, when you look at things, you'll find that even though they look different, essentially all the knobs and buttons are the same. Even if they're in a different spot and are named differently, they basically do the same things. Some of the decisions, as I've said, are a little kooky, but that kind of kookiness is not at all abnormal in this style of synth. The sorts of things that TAL likes, clearly from what he does, they had all made very idiosyncratic decisions, often based on what they could fit on the printed circuit board and what they could afford to put in for the dollar value that they were going to sell this device for. But nonetheless, that comes through here. But in terms of an instrument, especially if you're after that warm, fat, Rolandy type sound, beautiful, beautiful little instrument that can do an awful lot more than you think on the surface. So you can grow quite a fair way with it, and down the track still go, oh yep, I'll reach for that. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you want to know any more or want to learn more about various products, then please subscribe yourself to thehigherhertz.com and keep up to date with things that are happening. You have a good day now.